Good evening. I'd like to start tonight off with some video footage of a recent Russian missile strike on the Reikartz hotel in Zaporozhzhia, which the Russians alleged was to attack some NATO staff and mercenaries. Let's just have a look at this. Please, just as we start to watch this, just draw your attention to the fact that there is already some black smoke billowing here in the far distance of this photo at the end of what looks to be a long plaza or pathway here. Now let's just watch this. I'll just pause that there now. Look, now I apologise for the video that's got children in war. It's not my intent to leverage off that at all. I just wanted to show this because I think this is a compelling piece of video. Just demonstrates the reality that people in Ukraine are living through in terms of this war. This is allegedly, so this video is allegedly of a missile strike on the Reikartz hotel in Zaporozhzhia. Now, there are varying stories about what happened here, and this is interesting. The Ukrainian and Western media stories are quite different to the Russian one. What's interesting is that some of the Western ones are quite different from each other too. So, in the main Western reporting about this, the reporting is from Sky News, for example. I've looked at a number of different Western reports. Sky News indicating that one person was killed in this attack, and that the hotel was being used for a children's camp. However, if I go to DW, German reporting, German paper, but still Western, here we learn that the hotel in question, the Reikartz, was frequented by United Nations and NGOs, non-government organisations. Now, NGOs, as many of you will know, can be quite interesting organisations. They often provide to a government a level of plausible deniability and a means of operating within other nations without it being seen as the government themselves influencing the operations of these NGOs. They'll often operate under a humanitarian guise, which may in some cases be part of what they do, but also they will have another agenda, a governmental agenda, which they're operating under. Now, the reporting's not indicating what NGOs were there. Interestingly, though, the Russian reporting on this is that the missile strike was carried out in order to target NATO staff and foreign mercenaries in Zaporozhzhia. Now, there's no question that there are foreign mercenaries and NATO command staff in Ukraine in this war. There have been foreign mercenaries in Ukraine since 2014, at least, operating since that time in terms of providing training or what have you. And there are multiple reports of mercenaries from various nations operating throughout Ukraine in this conflict. The reason that if I just go back here, the reason that I asked you to just note down that there was already smoke in the background there was to just to make sure that we're aware this was the second missile strike, at least, but let's say the second missile strike on this hotel. So the attack here was intentional. This wasn't a misguided missile that landed here by mistake, and Russia is not claiming that. This isn't being claimed as a failed air defense missile. No, this is being claimed and owned by Russia as an attack on foreign mercenaries. Now, you can choose which of these stories you think is more believable. That Russia chose to just wantonly waste 2 very expensive missiles on a hotel where they knew there was a children's camp going on. To what end that would have benefited the Russians in any way, I really can't see. Or perhaps more likely the Russians did obtain intelligence indicating that this hotel was being frequented or was housing mercenaries and NATO staff. Now, as I said, NATO staff and mercenaries are in the country. They have to stay somewhere. It's entirely possible that they were housed at this hotel. Now, that, rightly or wrongly, does happen. Just like you shouldn't have air defense systems close to residential and civilian areas, you shouldn't be housing mercenaries and military command centres. However, doing so, if you can get away with it, perhaps provides you with some level of cover until, perhaps as in this case, it's identified that location of where those foreign mercenaries are. Now, the reason that I tend to feel that this is probably a Russian attack on what they believe to be foreign mercenaries. One, the intent, that not just one missile, but at least the second missile striking. And from some history. Now, about 6 weeks ago, we had another incident where a Russian missile strike on a hotel occurred, and their initial claims were that this was an attack on civilians. However, footage emerged shortly after, which showed large numbers of military personnel immediately there, not people who had arrived after some time to assist, but immediately there in the aftermath of the blast, many of them with insignia and some with tattoos indicating that they were from other countries, even from the Rangers. I did a video on it on the channel a little while back on the Rangers American unit in Ukraine. Now, while this was denied by the West, video footage emerged indicating that this was the case. So again, I think it's quite possible that this attack was a coordinated attack based on intelligence that the Russians had received or obtained, indicating that NATO command and mercenaries were in this hotel. This isn't the only attack on mercenaries reported in the last few days. Another one in Nikolayevka in the Lugansk People's Republic is reported from the one of the Russian battlegroup spokesman, Vadim Astafyev, that the crew of a Tornado M multiple launch rocket system struck an area where foreign mercenaries were training at a training ground in Nikolayevka. So there are now multiple reports of these attacks being made on mercenaries. I'm just going to jump to another video here, which I'd like to show you. This video is one which, let's just have a look at this. This video here is one which I think demonstrates, there's no sound with this one, it's allegedly a T-90 Russian tank and 2 BMPs making an assault on a Ukrainian position near Klescheevka. It looks as though the tank has landed a shell on the top left on that building, causing most of the white smoke. And now the BMPs are firing their cannons and causing these orange flashes that you can see. The reason I think this video is interesting is I think that this is a visual demonstration of what the Ukrainians were hoping to achieve with their large armoured column assaults at the start of the offensive in June of this year. Now, in this video, you can see that the tank and the 2 BMPs, their assault is very brutal, it's very forceful. There's constant firing from the BMPs and from the T-90 tank. They get to a position here where they then disgorge a number of troops into this area. You can just see them now starting to leave one of the BMPs, and then once they have deployed those troops, the tank and the BMPs drop some smoke for cover, and then they retreat out of the area, they withdraw from the area, and continue to provide some covering fire for the troops that they have deployed in there. Now, this I think is a very interesting video. As I say, it just demonstrates this is a successful attack. While I don't have numbers or information on the number of Ukrainians that were holding this position, clearly you can see at least the insertion of the troops was successful. All three of them, if the video continues, you'll see the three of them escape. And it appears as though they had full fire control over the area while they were performing the maneuver. Now, the big difference here between this successful attack and the ones that the Ukrainians have been attempting, one of the factors at least appears to be that these tanks were able to travel unencumbered across these fields, and so that these fields, I'm imagining or guessing, are not mined or were not mined. So you could see how the attempts to make this type of an attack could work if you weren't in an area which is heavily mined, or if this area was mined, it has successfully been demined somehow so that they were able to make this approach unencumbered by mines in the area. There doesn't seem to be, during the brief footage that we have, artillery going on. It seems to be the tanks and the BMPs assaulting only. Now, that's not to say that this area wasn't just softened up by artillery just prior to this attack, and it quite probably was. And the reason that these pieces of armour withdraw so quickly after dropping the soldiers is that they themselves would not want to then fall victim to anti-tank guided missiles or Ukrainian artillery. But yeah, look, an interesting video showing a very successful attack with armour, and made me think that that's perhaps what the Ukrainians were hoping to achieve in those early days with some big assaults like this. And you could see how if the ground wasn't mined, you could bust through, and they could have made quite a lot of ground. Okay, just going to jump down to one other video here. If you just give me a moment. Now, this is some video of the air defense operating in Odessa last night. Now, you can see here that the sky is very, very active. A lot of what looks to be like anti-aircraft gun and cannon fire, and then also numbers of anti-aircraft interceptor missiles going up. There are a number of explosions like that just there, which would seem to indicate successful interception of drones. In this case, reportedly, there were a large number of geranium drones flying in. Now, what you'll see in a moment, however, is a large explosion. Now, whatever that was got through and seemed to silence almost all of the air defense immediately. Now, I'm not aware of what that was that came in or what it struck, but you could see from that video that the intense, heavy air defense ceased almost immediately. So now, whether that was a successful strike on something like one of the radar systems commanding a lot of the air defense in that area, that's possible, although the explosion looked to be very, very large. So I don't know that there are reports yet of what was struck in that case. There is some other very interesting footage from last night from Odessa from another angle. Some of the air defense showing what appears to be an air defense interceptor missile failing, launching traveling for a short distance and then returning to Earth and exploding on impact. It's unclear where that landed and what damage may have been done, but this is a good video example, not the one I've just shown, but the one I'm talking about is a good video example of how air defense missiles can fail and can cause damage, and lends credence to some of the counter-arguments made by the Russians over some of the damage done to Ukrainian apartment blocks and a church in Odessa, where the mainstream narrative has been that they were attacks callously made by Russian Iskander missiles on these targets. However, the evidence, the video evidence and photographic evidence displayed afterwards seems to indicate for two strong reasons that it wasn't Russian Iskander, and in fact was more likely a failed Ukrainian air defense missile. Those two pieces of evidence being that in both cases the size of the damage done was not comparable to what you would expect from an Iskander, which would have done far, far more damage. And the other being that there were the telltale signs of the fragmentation of the air defense missile in the plaster of walls of the church. Now, the Iskander explosion is a very big explosion. The air defense missiles, those interceptor missiles, when they explode in like almost a donut or a ring of fragments. They don't actually generally hit the missile that they are attempting to disable and destroy. Instead, they get themselves close enough and then they explode in a fragmentation cloud. And there were clear video and photographic evidence of what appeared to look like the result of fragmentation components striking the walls rather than the Iskander, which would have almost certainly vaporized the walls in those cases. Some of the reporting from the Odessa geranium drone and missile strikes overnight is indicating that they were on oil depots in the harbour. So I don't know if that footage we watched earlier in that large explosion may perhaps have been something like an oil tank, oil storage facility being struck. I'm not sure. It was an unusual explosion. It was appeared to be a very big one, but with no great deal of ongoing fire to it. So who knows what that was. Also, over the weekend, there were a lot of stories about the Kerch Bridge. There was a lot of activity from Ukrainian social media that the Kerch Bridge had been struck. Almost immediately, some of the Russian commentators came out and claimed this wasn't true. Reportedly, what had happened was that three drones had been sent towards the Kerch Bridge. They had been shot down, and then as part of the defence of the Kerch Bridge, smoke screens were deployed on the bridge. So while a lot of the very enthusiastic Ukrainian social media reports came out showing pictures of the Kerch Bridge with smoke billowing off it from 4 points, claiming that at least 4 strikes had occurred on the bridge. Reports came out shortly after that the bridge was completely fine, was open and is operating again. What this did demonstrate was part of the defensive approach that the Russians are taking to the Kerch Bridge, in that these large smoke screen producing devices have been deployed on the bridge. Now, someone mentioned in some of the commentary about this, why would they bother with that? Surely the Ukrainians know where the Kerch Bridge is and they can have their drones and their missiles dialed in on that. I think with the missiles, yes, perhaps. I think the counter-argument was that there will be some very strong electronic warfare, anti-drone capability in the electronic warfare space positioned around the Kerch Bridge, and that much of the final targeting by those drones, and perhaps even by some missiles, there have been reports of S-200s being repurposed to be ground-to-ground instead of ground-to-air, that some of their latter stages of their targeting are actually visual and require database matching of images that the camera of the drone can see as it's on approach to pre-programmed images it has of its target, the bridge, so that if the bridge was obscured in smoke, it would perhaps disable its ability to confirm a target and then stop it from being able to strike. A little bit of a summary on just what has been happening on the battlefronts. Now, the battlefronts for the last week or so have been doing it's almost like a slow spiral. The northeastern front line is slowly curving its way around to the west towards Kupiansk. And at the bottom, it's bulging and curving slightly down towards the southwest as the Ukrainian forces push down through Robotne, past Artyomovsk and to Zaporozhzhia. A little bit of the information on some of what's happened in the last day or so. I'll just read some of these reports here. In the Zaporozhzhia direction, the main events continue to develop around Robotne, on the Artyomovsk sector of the front. The enemy attacks, in this case, this is Russian reporting, so this is the Ukrainian attacks here, come wave after wave after wave, and foreign mercenaries take part in them, among other things. The reports are that the Russian units are holding up, being competent in their defence, and that the Russians are reporting very, very heavy losses to the Ukrainians, both in men and in their armoured vehicles in the Zaporozhzhia region. So while some advances are being made, pushing down past Robotny, to Artyomovsk, while these advances, and they are not large advances, but while these small advances are being made by the Ukrainians, the reporting is that they are coming at a very, very heavy and unsustainable cost in terms of equipment and, more importantly, lives of Ukrainian men. In the South Donetsk region is the battle for Zaporozhzhia. The Russian reports that the Ukrainians managed to cling to the outskirts of the village. And the situation here is changing very quickly. And this has been happening in many of these hotly contested areas. And Klescheevka is another one, which we'll get to in a moment. Zaporozhzhia, Robotino, Artyomovsk, Reikartz previously, where there would be claims from the Ukrainians in the morning that they had captured the settlement, and then in the afternoon there'd be claims from the Russians that they captured it. Both of them substantiated with video. But these towns existing, or these settlements existing really in a grey zone, often the settlement is under artillery control by both sides. And so while the Ukrainians or the Russians may try to advance through the settlement, they'll get there, they can raise a flag, they can take a video that they were there and geolocate it to confirm they control the settlement for a moment, but then they rapidly withdraw as incoming shelling comes from the other side. So I guess going on with the update from the South, the next region, the situation here is changing very quickly, and positions are changing hands. The intensity of the fighting is very high. Artillery is actively working on both sides. The command of the armed forces of Ukraine is transferring a large number of reserves and armoured vehicles here, apparently choosing here for the main direction for the strike. So this is the South Donetsk region down to the southwest of the next city itself, which is getting towards one of the thinner points if you were to go south from there to cut through to the Sea of Azov, which is, we believe, the intent of the Ukrainian offensive, which is to be able to break through here or somewhere near here and go down and then get through to Tokmak, and from Tokmak to Melitopol, and then from Melitopol to the Sea of Azov, perform that, and then launch a heavy Storm Shadow Scalp, or possibly Taurus. The Germans confirming that they will now provide the Taurus missiles to Ukraine. The Taurus missiles, very similar to the British Storm Shadow and the French Scalp missiles in terms of capability. A couple of additional benefits of the Taurus missile being they have a slightly longer range. They can travel out to about 300 miles or 500 kilometres. And I believe they have a more advanced and useful fusing system, so that they can be better calibrated to perform bunker busting activities, or an activity such as attempting to destroy a bridge, where your missile may initially hit the road surface of the bridge and you wish to punch through that and not detonate then, but instead detonate when you reach one of the structural members, the legs of the bridge. And the Taurus fusing capability apparently is more sophisticated and allows for things like that. It allows for precision to a level such that you could strike the roof of a building, know how many floors are in the building, and configure the Taurus to penetrate through the concrete floors until it reached the desired floor and then explode. Inside of the missile itself, the fusing component is able to detect the seismic shock of going through concrete, count them until it gets to the right number, and then detonate its main warhead. Anyhow, as I was going back to that, Ukrainians then, after they've driven down through Zaporozhzhia and made it to the Sea of Azov, launch a heavy strike on the Kerch Bridge with Taurus, Storm Shadow, Scalp missiles to destroy and then effectively cut off Crimea from Russian resupply. This would then give them the bargaining tool that they've looked for, which they've lacked so far, and which is not allowing them to negotiate with the Russians at this stage, because at this stage they have nothing to negotiate with. As I've discussed previously, the recent peace talks in Jeddah, which were arranged at Anthony Blinken, the US Secretary of State's request, really weren't peace talks. And many commentators, Alexander Mercouris of the Duran, for example, and I tend to agree with Alexander, that these were planned for this date with the expectation that Ukraine would have reached the Sea of Azov, and that by now they would be able to meet and discuss the negotiation points of the peace negotiations with Russia. However, without being able to achieve the goal of capturing Ukraine, that meeting really was moot, and there was no real outcome from it. Okay, in the Artyomovsk region, so Artyomovsk, which is the Russian name for the town of Bahkmut, where there's been fighting since last year, heavy fighting since sort of October of last year. And it became perhaps the most widely covered area of fighting over the first half of this year, due in part to the fact that the Wagner forces were fighting there, the Wagner PMC, and their leader Yevgeny Prigozhin and his penchant for publicity. He seemed to allow his Wagner fighters, more so than the regular Russian armed forces, to provide updates, to release information to social media, which allowed us to get a lot more of an idea of what was happening in that area. So, in Artyomovsk, just to the southwest of Artyomovsk is the small town of Klescheevka. The reporting here is that the armed forces of Ukraine have failed to occupy the key heights around Klescheevka. So the Russian armed forces have an advantage and are able to cover the attacking personnel and armoured vehicles of the enemy. So with the Russians holding the higher ground around Klescheevka, the continued Ukrainian attack seemed to be at a disadvantage at this stage. On the remaining sectors of this front, local clashes are taking place. Apparently the enemy, this is the Ukrainians, is testing the ground and attacking in small groups, but has no success in this. Klescheevka has been one of the areas in the last month which has seen some of the heaviest fighting, just sustained attack after attack after attack from the Ukrainians. But again, the progress in this area has been nil, non-existent really. There have been periodic progress into parts of Klescheevka, and then they've been pushed back out again. So no sustained success in that area. Now in the Svato or Kupiansk direction. So Kupiansk is up in the north of the battlefront, getting up towards Kharkiv and the Kharkiv region. And Kupiansk is the Oskol River, runs down through there. Now from there down to Krasny Liman, which is the north of Bahkmut, Artyomovsk. In that whole front, it's about a 90-kilometer front. The Russians have been making progress over the last 4 weeks, 5 weeks there. Continued progress. Reporting over the weekend was that the settlement of Sinkovka has been lost. The Ukrainians were holding that, and that 11,000 residents in this area are being evacuated from 53 separate settlements. This has been announced by the Ukrainians, and that's due to fears that the Russians will continue to roll westward to Kupiansk, take Kupiansk, and then they will have reached the Oskol River, and they will then proceed south down the Oskol River, supporting the western advances from Liman and the Kremenaya forest area just above that area there. Using the Oskol as a natural barrier on their right flank as they proceed south. So once Kupiansk falls and the Russians get to the Oskol, that is a big almost sort of strategic advance for the Russians, as if they are able to rapidly roll down south, consolidate that entire area, and then move across the Oskol, they can then start to advance on Kharkiv itself. What else? A little bit here. Yeah, just interesting again. The Black Sea. The Russian Navy stopped a Ukrainian boat today and gave it a thorough search. There's again quite impressive helicopter skills. A Russian helicopter hovering just off the deck of this Ukrainian freighter. Russian forces then giving the boat a once-over, inspecting it for weapons, explosives, and contraband, I'm sure. So it looks like where they can, the Russians may do this on any ships they see traveling through this area. They will inspect them using military force. Reports that this is from early this morning, that NATO reconnaissance drones were active over the southwestern area and sort of middle south area of the Black Sea. This is interesting because in the past, when there have been naval drone attacks on the Kerch Bridge, on the Russian Navy, on the SIG tanker recently, that there have also been NATO and US reconnaissance drones in the area at that time, and they are believed to be providing support in coordinating and perhaps the targeting of those drones upon their targets. Look for the Ukraine update. That's probably about it for me today. Just a little bit on Niger and Africa. Now, this is an ongoing situation. There have been some reports today that the new leadership in Niger is willing to meet, perhaps not negotiate, but meet with ECOWAS, which is the West African states economic community. However, there's also reports that the rebels in Niger say that they will prosecute the ousted president Bazoum for treason and undermining the country's security. Now, obviously, the military has enacted a coup and thrown Bazoum out of his presidency. that may well have been done for reasons for concern of treason and undermining the country's security. Niger, previously a French colony, gained its independence in 1960 from France. There are growing, it seems, growing desires for African nations to reclaim back ownership of their rich natural resources, and get themselves out from under the colonizing forces. Now, while they have their independence, reportedly, the deals that the French hold with Niger in terms of the purchase of uranium, for example, are incredibly beneficial for the French. So they're able to extract uranium from Niger at a mere pittance, and then use that or on-sell that at massive profit. Now the new leader of Niger was stating that they are an incredibly resource-rich nation, and yet they are poor and starving. That something is wrong there. There's also been reports from the new leadership there that, when they've been threatened with French aid being stopped to them. Again, the same response. We are a resource-rich nation and we are very poor. We've had French aid for 60 years. It hasn't helped us, so it's not going to hurt us for it to stop. There definitely seems to be a push in Niger to break the shackles of that French colonialism in the country. However, the country is coming, under more unsettled forces. There are reports that IS militants attacked the Niger army barracks 100 kilometers from the capital of Niamey. Islamic State, it's been reported, attacked the barracks. There has been ongoing fighting with the nation for some time. The group Boko Haram, Islamic State, and Al-Qaeda have all been operational there. At the moment, there are some level of Wagner forces operating in Niger. In what capacity and what number is not clear yet, but there was last week a request made to them. They were in the neighbouring Mali at the time, for them to come and talk. Yevgeny Prigozhin announced that his Wagner forces were for hire and would help if requested to by the new leadership. And he suggested they would be able to provide protection against terrorist forces. Now, there are reports coming out that this increase in terrorist activity in Niger may be somewhat guided by the hand of the West, perhaps the US and the French, who may be communicating with some of these organisations and suggesting that there would be benefit for them if they were to cause trouble to the new leadership. Clearly, the West, the US, and France in particular, do not want this new leadership in Niger, where they have announced that they will suspend all export of uranium and gold. France needs that uranium dearly for its nuclear power generation. Without it, it will then have further pressure put upon it as the looming winter comes. The French will be hoping that it's going to be a warm and a mild winter. If it's not, if it's a cold one, they will have real problems with keeping the people of their country, of the country of France, warm, particularly if they start to suffer shortages in uranium. That may not impact them this winter, but again, it's going to become very expensive if they need to get that from another source. So Niger, Africa, an interesting one for us to watch. Thank you If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're enjoying the channel. If you haven't already subscribed, please do subscribe, leave a comment, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.